morning, sun. How are you? Skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and love. Good, good, good morning, sun. Good, good, good morning. Good, good morning. Good morning, sun. How are you? Skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and love. Good, good, good morning, sun. Good morning, life. Good morning, sun. How are you? Skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and love.
And good morning. Cheers. Happy Friday. And today I share yet another story of me encountering a random issue that, in this case, is a little unique in that it appears to be only certain situations. So some people don't get this error. I am getting this error. So, with that, let me figure out what I'm doing here. Where am I? Okay. So thank you for the people who've helped. My friend Tanya Henderson, Mary Thompson for jumping on a call with me as well, and AJ Kaufman for also early on giving me some feedback on this. I don't know what the issue is, but at least they seem to have helped kind of narrow down what the issue, where the issue is occurring. So the issue relates to a Power Automate flow. And if you haven't used Power Automate, I think of it as like an integration tool. So it is kind of like a orchestration engine, a integration engine, and it lets you connect to A and pull data from A and send it to B, or grab data from this data source and send it over here. So it pushes and pulls and massages data and automates things. So I have a Power Automate flow that detects when a new version of BC Container Helper has been released. And when that happens, when it detects a change in the version number, it automatically posts a tweet on my Twitter account. So you'll see a notification that says a new version of BC Container Helper has been released. And here's the release note. So whenever you see that on my Twitter feed, that's actually a fully automated flow. I don't even know when those messages get posted or those tweets get posted because Flow handles it for me. So I may get an email from my automated task that updates BC Container Helper, but Flow is actually my Power Automate flow is getting triggered unbeknownst to me. It's completely automatic. So in the context of Business Central, you can retrieve data from Business Central or insert data into Business Central, even update data. You can delete records. So you can basically work with Business Central records through Power Automate. And it's effectively using the API behind the scenes to insert, update, delete, whatever you need. Nice in theory. So there have been a few iterations of the Business Central connectors in Power Automate. And at the moment, they appear to have connectors that say V3. And so in parentheses, so it'll say create record V3. So that's what you see here. And it will also say preview. And I'm now realizing that there may be a very good reason that it says preview. And that is because sometimes it doesn't work. Now, some of the operations may work fine, but certain operations or certain API calls may not work properly, may not work completely, may be missing some fields. I don't know how to assess the status of how complete these endpoints are. So it's just a Power Automate flow, people tell me. How hard could it be, right? It works for me. Like, come on. I'm sure there are dozens of other people using this, so why are you having a problem? It must be you, Steve. Perhaps. But anyway, story of my life, right? So when I create this very, very, very simple flow, environment, company, API is v2.0, table name, journal lines. Table name, not the greatest field label, but fine. It's calling the journal lines endpoint, inserting a journal line. Not hard, right? I specify journal ID just to keep things super simple. And yes, it is a correct journal ID. What do I get? Error. You must specify a journal batch ID or a journal ID to get a journal line. What? So, first of all, there is no field available when you're importing a journal line. There is no field called journal batch ID. That's all you got. And the only header records as far as I can tell are journal ID and journal display name. I'm assuming display name is not the best field to use for this, so I've just been using journal ID. No journal batch ID. I am specifying the journal ID. But what does this error say? Application dialog exception, you must specify a journal batch ID or a journal ID to get a journal line. So there is no journal batch ID. I am sending in the journal ID, and I don't want to get a journal line. I want to insert a journal line. So this error is not the greatest, needless to say, understatement, right? So what's going on here? I'm just like, it doesn't work. I tried it this way. I tried it that way. I tried 12 different ways. I tried 50 different times, verified my IDs. What's going on? So I am, as you can see here, submitting the journal ID. And that is the output. That's the display, the inputs for my flow over on the left. And here you'll notice this is the raw input. This is what the flow purports to be sending to Business Central. Well, you may notice, I mean, the JSON payload is funky. I don't quite know what's going on behind the scenes, but this is not a standard JSON payload for a Business Central API. So that is a clue. Look at this payload, and my interpretation is Flow is assembling this unique payload, and the connector is doing some type of transformation or mapping or something in order to get that sent to the Business Central Web API. Because if you try to send this to the Business Central Web API, like, it absolutely will not work. It's not the right format at all. So that tells me something. Okay, so I'm sending in the journal ID. So let's just take a look and see this. So just so you, well, you may still think I'm crazy, but I'll at least show you why I think I'm not crazy. So here I have my Power Automate flow, right? It's just a manual trigger. I'm just creating a journal line. And number one question, well, Steve, are you sure you're sending in the right journal ID? Understandable. Let's go over to my Postman and run a query, and let's look at the journals. So I'm going to expand this, and I'm trying to go to one called import. And so you say A5, FF, 60, blah, blah, blah. And let's compare that to, if I can do this right. So there we go. We've got the A5, B4, 5E, 60, B5, EC11, etc., ending in FD37. And if you want, I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to paste it. It's the exact same value. Done this 50 times. Okay, so I know this is a valid journal ID because that is my import journal. That is the ID. Okay, and I'll show you later that I'm using the same ID to insert in Postman. Works fine. So here we have Power Automate. And I've updated this, and I'll save it. And now let me go back to my flow, and you see I have an abundant number of failures. So let's run this. And it connects. I'm going to run my flow, and there we go. So in 1 second, it failed. Okay, so application dialog exception, you must specify journal batch ID or journal ID. There it is. Don't know what to tell you. So I talked to AJ. He says, you must be doing something wrong because it works for me. I get feedback from Mary. She says, you must be doing something wrong because it works for me. So I'm like, okay, maybe it's my Business Central environment, because I'm using just a demo sandbox environment. It's not a paid Business Central environment. Everything else works fine. I can use Postman, use APIs, everything is fine. It's just Power Automate Flow, and it's just journal line. I can import a journal header, a journal batch, just fine. But if I try to add a line, it does not work. So then I get on a call with Tanya, and I say, well, let's try this in your environment. She has a completely separate environment, paid Business Central tenant, a separate Power Automate environment. She sets up the exact same flow, gets the exact same error. Now you might say, well, of course, it's exactly the same, but she walked through the process. She figured it out. I watched her do it. I didn't want to influence her to make the same mistakes I did. And she's getting the same error in her Business Central environment with her Power Automate environment. So what's going on? So then I get on a call with Mary. She's like, you must be doing something wrong because it works for me. And I showed her, doesn't work. She looked at her environment. She did the exact same thing. It worked. So she's wondering what's going on. So the one thing that was promising for just a fraction of a second is in Power Automate. If you click on this gear here, it'll go into settings and you can click on View Power Automate Settings. So she had me go in here, and I did not have a display language defined. So we chose English. Did not have a regional format defined, so I chose United States. And she recommended enabling experimental features, turning this on. And this, in the context of this, what this theoretically does, and you may want to do this or not want to do this, but the reason she wanted to turn this on is to get access to updated versions or fixed versions of the Business Central connector, because she said there have been bugs in the older versions of the Business Central connector. And if you look at the Create Record V2 for Business Central, you'll see it's just missing fields. It's kind of, yeah, it doesn't work. So experimental features, even though I saw V3, she wanted to enable this. And sure enough, after enabling that, I had to log out, log back in, I had to create new flows. This connector changed. Even though it still said Business Central V3, something else to see, secure inputs, no. Okay, so where does it say V3? There it is, Create Record V3. Even though this is the same as what I saw before, I noticed something different. When I click on this dropdown, the results are different. It's not just a very simple list of options. It has this add custom item, it has a search, and it has the company names with 2 lines instead of 1. Same, or environment names. Same with the company. Notice here, it has Cronus and a GUID. It did not have that before, even though I was using V3. So use the experimental features, or enabling the experimental features definitely changed the connector that I was using. So it updated it to a newer version. So that was interesting. But despite that, and you can also search for your endpoints here. despite that, this still does not work. So I was wondering, okay, what is going on? Works for her, does not work for me. So my current interpretation is that it is a bug in the Power Automate connector, and for some reason it's not properly translating or sending in the values for the fields. So even though it looks like everything is assigned, it must not be properly transforming this journal ID and submitting it to the BC API. It's my only guess that I can come up with, because it does work for Mary. So now I was thinking, well, if we get geeky here, what if we look at application insights? And I don't think this is going to be terribly productive, but I just wanted to see, okay, what do we have going on here? So I have traces from the last hour. And if I scroll down here, I made a call at 4:12 UTC here. And so you see it is calling, here, let me try to make this bigger. And, okay. It is calling the metadata, and the calls from Power Automate will look very different from Postman. Okay. So it is calling the metadata, open company, calls the metadata, gets company, and there's journal lines. So it looks like it's calling, but this does not log the actual data that is being sent. So we see the call. Unfortunately, we don't see the data that is submitted. So we can't see whether it is properly sending over the journal ID. So that is the frustrating part. So we see client request, workflow, web services call. Yeah. Now, just to show you that, in concept, this should work, I go over to, let me delete this, my test record. I can go back into flow, and I have a flow just to create the journal header, right? So it doesn't attempt to do the lines. It just creates a new general journal batch. And so exactly the same. Sandbox 1 Cronus v2.0 journals, not journal lines. And I'm calling it flow 1 testing flow, right? Super simple. I'm going to click on run flow, done, refresh, succeeded. And if you go back here, there's my create journal. There's an output of the new ID. So it's submitting the journal. It's getting back the ID of the journal. Everything is fine. Show raw inputs. Pretty straightforward. So I've tried creating the journal, getting the ID from that new journal, using that in the journal lines. Doesn't work. No matter what I try, no matter how I try to send in that ID to the journal line creation process in Power Automate, it just won't work. And just to do another proof, if we go to Power Automate, I am able to post a new line to an existing journal. So I'm using journals, journal ID, journal lines as the endpoint, and I'm going to click send. Successful. That was line 30,000. So I can now go back to Business Central, and in my import journal, you can see that I'm able to successfully import lines. So the Business Central API endpoint for journal lines does work. There is a bug in it, at least one bug, but for a basic line without the balancing account, it does work. And the Power Automate journal insert works, but just the journal line. And given that I'm having the issue and Tanya is having the issue, but Mary and AJ aren't, we're seeing a 50-50 split here. Tanya and I can't get it to work. AJ and Mary are able to get it to work. And Mary said she has several customers using it. So I do not understand. So this started, like my prior video, this started as a 15-minute exercise to just validate and test and do a proof of concept with the Business Central journal import. And here, let me switch screens. It started as a 15-minute just proof of concept. Okay, let me just make sure that this journal import works properly because the customer wants to use Power Automate. And I started with Postman, ran into the balancing account bug. I then moved on to Power Automate, created a flow. I'm now finding a Business Central connector bug. I'm assuming it's a bug. So, man, it is just fraught with risk. What should be a very, very simple process, unfortunately, I just cannot guarantee to a customer that any given single small operation will work successfully until I test it. And now I'm a little concerned that this is happening in my environment. It's happening in Tanya's environment. It may or may not work in the customer's environment. If it does work in the customer's environment, that's great, but that means we need to develop and test and prototype and do everything in the customer's environment because we're unable to build this outside of or in our environments. So it's a little concerning. So I'm going to, Mary recommended posting this issue to Yammer. I've written a blog post on this. So if you want the gory details, blog.steveendo.com. And so, there we go. So blog.steveendo.com. I've written this up as a blog post with, everything I've gone through, the error message, because Tanya and I did find at least 2 or 3 articles about others who have had the same issue. And Mary speculated that they were using an older version of the connector or one that did have bugs. And so that makes a lot of sense. But now I'm still having this issue as of April 2022. So with that, yeah, it's just one Power Automate flow. How hard can it be? So if someone has a secret, knows the secret to how to get this to work, I'm happy to let you try in my environment because I now know that just because it works in someone else's environment, that's great. It doesn't work in mine, and I don't think it's anything I'm doing wrong. So, yeah. So have a good weekend. Happy Friday. Do something fun and go find some bugs. Okay, talk to you later.
Good morning, sun.